In our final video regarding the male reproductive system, we're going to look at the specific effects caused by the primary male sex hormone, testosterone. Now, as a sex hormone, testosterone has a rather well-known set of physical changes that it causes within the male body, especially during puberty. But more interestingly, perhaps for some, are the psychological or behavioral effects that are also mediated by high levels of testosterone, and they will prove a little bit controversial, so let's take them with a grain of salt. Before that, though, testosterone falls within a larger family of hormones that we call the androgen hormones, and we can see from the prefix derived from the Greek andros, meaning male, that an androgen hormone is simply a male specialized sex hormone, of which testosterone is the most common. Now, before we focus on each of the major psychological effects mediated by testosterone, it should be said that males, as well as any member of the human species, are not slaves to our biology. And just because testosterone is correlated with these two psychological effects doesn't mean that males don't have the ability to override their behavior and let cooler heads prevail, so to speak. So the first behavior that testosterone is correlated with is the idea of libido, which is just a fancy way of saying sexual desire or sexual arousal, the need for which is very basic and is simply there to give us the impetus to reproduce and perpetuate the species. But once again, just because high testosterone levels correspond with a high level of libido doesn't mean that men lose all self-control and doesn't mean that we lose the ability to moderate ourselves. This also applies for the second and possibly even more controversial characteristic, that being an increase in aggressiveness or aggressive behavior, particularly in situations where it comes to intraspecific, that being competition that exists between multiple humans. Now, once again, just because higher levels of aggression are correlated with high levels of testosterone in the male body doesn't mean men become horribly uncontrollable killing machines in cases of competition, because we as humans have the ability to moderate our behavior and exercise some self-control, thereby transcending our biology, if you will permit a little bit of poetic interpretation here. So once again, humans, including males, not slaves to our biology, regardless of whether the behaviors are linked to high levels of testosterone. Rather less controversially are the physical effects that are mediated by testosterone. The primary physical sexual characteristics are the ones that directly connect to reproduction. For example, the most noticeable one is the enlargement of the penis to allow for sexual intercourse required for reproduction. But regardless of the size and function of the penis, it would not be able to perform its function if the testes that make sperm were not able to function, nor if the prostate gland, which manufactures a large number of components of semen, if this were not to function, then reproduction would not be able to take place either. But of course, none of these would make any difference at all if men were not able to produce sperm, because without sperm, men would not be able to contribute their genetic component in the requirement for reproduction. So, definitely important, all of these three characteristics here. However, those three are by no means the only examples of physical characteristics that are moderated by testosterone. One of the first things that males undergoing puberty will notice is an increased level of muscle mass and also an increased rate at which muscle growth occurs. Another very noticeable feature is hair that begins to grow around the face and around genitalia, neither of which tend to happen in prepubescent boys. Now, as you listen to my voice, you can probably pick up on this characteristic here, the enlargement of the larynx. Obviously, my voice is significantly deeper compared to the way it was when I was a prepubescent boy, and this is linked to the enlargement of the larynx, also called the Adam's apple, in men. Also noticeably as well are changes to the upper body, specifically a widening of the shoulders, corresponding to a drastic increase in upper body strength. And in addition to this is enlargement of both the hands and feet, again, possibly due to the evolutionary need for greater manual dexterity and greater mobility that comes with adulthood. Now, with greater muscle mass comes a greater energy demand, as well as any time a muscle relaxes or contracts, it requires ATP, which means that more heat is going to be generated, thereby generating a need for increased perspiration, also known as sweat. So the more energy men produce, the more need for temperature control exists, which is why sweating happens more easily. Now, this is just a general trend, and it isn't always true, but generally the body fat content, which means the percent of the body that is composed of fat, tends to be lower in males than in female, but again, this is more of a guideline and isn't a hard and fast rule, as is a general trend to have heavier bone structure in men compared to women. But once again, there is a high degree of variability in any secondary sexual characteristic, often to the point where some of these features may actually occur more in women than in men, thus demonstrating how fickle and unpredictable the effects of hormones are from person to person. This concludes our video series on the male reproductive system. Before we move on to the next topic, you can take a look at this case study here that investigates the effects of taking anabolic steroids, which is actually a synthetic form of testosterone, often abused by bodybuilders or people in the weight training industry, and see if you can investigate what the possible effects are of artificially increasing your testosterone concentration and what effects it would have on the homeostatic regulation of the male reproductive system.